All right, let's dive in. We've turned off the waiting room so that as people join, they're good to come in. We are doing a great fast-paced half-hour speed through the Horticultural Award 2020. And this has come about through essentially the member inquiries coming through the workplace relations line. We've had a number of employers ask about, look, particularly if we're going from a zombie award onto the Hort Award, how do we get to understand the Hort Award? What are the key parts that we've got to be across? So yeah, QFVG and we have put together this webinar that's going to take you through it. So the way that we've designed this is we've essentially looked for the topics which are or the parts of the award which really impact most heavily on employment conditions. So this is not a line by line of the award. It is not every single detail. It is the stuff that we know has probably got the biggest impact on how we employ people, and the biggest impact on, I guess the things that we get phone calls about on the workplace relations line through QFVG. So we're going to dive in. I have to start with a little disclaimer. Please remember that what we cover here is general information. We're breaking a very long award down into the simplest possible terminology that we can. It is not specific legal advice. I'm not a lawyer to start with, but it's not specific legal advice or specific advice to your company. If you've got specific things that you need, that's what the workplace relations line is there for. As we go through this, if you've got questions that you would like to ask, please pop them into the chat function. If I've got a chance at the end, I will answer. If not, and they're ones that we can answer generally, we'll get that done after the webinar. All right, we're going to start with the most basic component, which is your employee categories. Now, this is pretty universal, any award that you look at. You've got full-time employees, they average 38 hours a week. You've got part-time employees who are permanent employees. They're guaranteed a set number of hours. It's just less than 38 in the week. And we have to tell them these are the hours that you're guaranteed. This is your typical work days, your start and finish times. And if we have them working hours over those set times, their payment for those extra hours are paid at overtime rates, even if those hours are still less than 38. And then for a casual, of course, these are the people who we roster as and when we need. Their hours go up and down. They've got no guarantee of minimum hours or anything like that. They receive a 25% casual loading. And that casual loading in the award is designed to offset the fact of they don't have security around hours. They don't receive any paid leave entitlements. They don't get notice of termination, a bunch of things like that. They get the 25% casual loading instead. Now, I know that about half of the attendees today have a zombie agreement that they are potentially coming off of. So where possible, I'll add a little bit of commentary around things that we might be seeing in those zombie EAs that can be a contrast. So one of the things that we have seen in a bunch of the zombie EAs are this concept of a long-term casual, or some of them have been dubbed as permanent casuals. So just know under award conditions, that technically doesn't exist. They're either full-time, part-time, or casual. And I think there's some ways that businesses can actually work around that long-term option, but that's a bit more of a specific situation. Next topic is ordinary hours of work. So this is covered by clause 13 in the award, and it is different for full-time, part-time. So the way to think about ordinary hours of work is what are the hours in which we can roster people, and what hours can we have them work and we pay them at ordinary rates. So for full-time and part-time employees, it's 152 hours in 4 weeks. It's essentially saying it's an average of 38 hours a week averaged over 4 weeks. It's Monday to Friday or Monday to Saturday with agreement, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. We can vary the hours by agreement between the employer and the majority of employees in a section. So what that means is you might agree with your employees to say, well, actually during the heat of summer, the scope of our ordinary hours will actually be 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. instead. We're allowed to sort of do that little bit of a movement. And then it's up to 8 ordinary hours a day, or again, by agreement, you can go up to 12 ordinary hours in a day. Keep in mind, you still can't exceed that 152 hours, but you could have an employee, for example, working 5 days at 12 hours a day, and then the following week do lesser hours. And on average, that means that they're still only working the 38 hours per week. You've got a little bit of flexibility that you can use there with your rostering. For your casual employees, their ordinary hours of work are 304 hours in 8 weeks. Now, this is a really key change for people who are currently on an EA. We're not seeing this all that often in the EA. Normally, the EA just says it's, casuals are paid the same flat rate. So under the award, casuals hours are averaged over an 8-week period. The 304, of course, adds up to 38 hours per week, but it's giving you more flexibility. So you could have an employee do all of their 304 hours in 5 weeks and then nothing for 3 weeks, and it's still okay that all of those 304 hours are classed as ordinary hours. That can be worked anytime. There's none of the, for casuals, there's none of the Monday to Friday, etc. It does have a scope of ordinary hours though, 5 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. So it's pretty broad. Again, by agreement, where where no daylight savings happens, it can be 4 till 7:30. So you can shift that a bit to fit your seasons. It's no more than 12 hours a day. Now, if someone happens to work outside of those hours, so outside of the 5 a.m. to 8:30, they get an additional 15% loading that just recognises the fact that they're working essentially at night time. And casuals need to be rostered a minimum of 2 hours per occasion. So you're not allowed to roster them only for an hour, for example. So casuals are, in this award, are very, very distinct from our full-time and part-time. What we've seen when we've been talking to businesses about transitioning from their zombie agreement over to the award is sometimes where they're worried about paying overtime rates, for example, because their casuals will do such intense hours for a short period of time. Sometimes our growers are saying, well, actually, if I can now average it over 8 weeks, I can still get the same outcome. I'm okay because my season or my peak parts of the season are short enough that I can get the averaging when I need to. So the next component here is overtime and penalty rates. So again, different for full-time, part-time and casual. So if we just focus on our full-time and part-time people to start with, on a Monday to Saturday, if they're working overtime, so remember overtime is beyond the 38-hour average or outside of the scope of ordinary hours. So Monday to Saturday, they get 150% of the ordinary rate. And Sunday, they get 200% except during harvest. So Monday to Saturday, 150%, and that's regardless of how much additional overtime on a Monday to Saturday. It doesn't, some people are familiar with this idea of it ticks over to 200% after 2 or 3 hours. That's not the case here. It's just 150% applies to all of the overtime. So 200% on a Saturday, but the award does recognise that harvest time changes. So during harvest, the first 8 hours in a week of overtime can include 5 hours on a Sunday, which is only at the 150% rate, not the 200. After that, Sunday's paid at the 200% rate. So it is allowing you some flexibility to go, well, we're going to get overtime worked on a Sunday, but those first 5 hours are still just at the 150% rate. There is also a clause in the award which states that if the majority of employees choose to work Sunday instead of Saturday, Saturday overtime rates apply, as in the 150%. But that is Sunday instead of Saturday. It's not Saturday and Sunday. It's them saying, look, that's our preference to do that instead. If you wanted to use that, I would recommend capturing somehow in writing that you've got that agreement with the majority of employees, that that's how the roster will happen. I can see we've just had a couple of questions in about, can we have the presentation and notes? So Natalie, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are recording the session and an email will go around to the attendees where you get the recording, and yes, we'll absolutely send these slides out as well. We know it's too hard to kind of keep up with as we go. Yep, recording, and we'll send it around. Awesome. So then for our casual employees, overtime and penalty rate. So again, keep in mind, we're talking about the situation of they're working more than 304 hours over 8 weeks. In that instance, or if they're working more than 12 hours in any one day, in that instance, they are paid 175%, and that includes the casual loading. So if you think about it, it's kind of the same as full-time and part-time, but it's saying it's 50% as overtime and 25% of casual loading, hence the 175% that gets applied. Really important that the calculation is ordinary rate times 175%. You will pay more than you need to if you go base rate times 125% to add casual loading, times 150% to get overtime. You will be accumulating rather than just applying one figure. And like I said earlier, hours worked outside of ordinary hours, so outside of that 5 to 8:30, that's going to attract a 15% loading on top of the casual rate. Shift work. Shift work is defined in the award as well, but only applies to full-time and part-time employees. So they've gone, interestingly, I'm not entirely sure why they bothered to define between afternoon and night shifts, because both of them are paid at 115%. But full-time and part-time employees who work an afternoon shift, so that's a shift that finishes after 6 and at or before midnight, or a night shift, so that's finishing after midnight and at or before 8, they're paid 115% of the ordinary hourly rate. Now, the way that this award is worded, it talks about the shift is defined by when it finishes. So if you have an employee who starts at 10 o'clock in the morning and finishes at 6:30 at night, that is defined as an afternoon shift, even though the bulk of the hours have happened during the day, because it finishes after 6, afternoon shift. And those shift rates do apply to the shift, the full shift. So when you are looking at how you roster and how you apply your shifts and finishing times, I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And we can't have an employee working longer than an 8-hour shift when it's afternoon or night without paying overtime. So it's definitely capped at that 8 this time. In terms of breaks, there's requirements under the and sorry, I will just say on the shifts and the ordinary hours as well, we have seen a lot of zombie EAs that simply don't have ordinary hours in there. So there's no real limitation around when employees are working. We've seen a lot of them that don't have night or afternoon shift in there, so there's no penalties payable for those times. So really important that growers who are under a zombie EA and haven't been paying shift rates or haven't been paying overtime rates, that you're aware that this now comes into play. So breaks, our meal breaks are unpaid. It's not less than 30 minutes, not more than an hour, and it needs to be no later than 5 hours after commencing. Now, from my conversations with growers, that no later than 5 hours after commencing can actually be a really impractical situation or circumstance for them. So it's one of the things that we're seeing most commonly altered a bit through enterprise agreements when they're being written. And then rest breaks. So employees are entitled to one paid 10-minute break per shift or day. You can have more, and certainly you've got to consider, of course, your fatigue and work health and safety. But according to the award, it is one paid 10-minute break per shift. Time off in lieu. Now, this is one that a lot of the zombie agreements have what was known as banked hours. And I want to explain the difference. So let me cover the award first. So TOIL under the award, time off in lieu, is essentially I work overtime, but instead of being paid for my overtime, I ask you to hold it in lieu. Now, that's fine. We can agree to that. And it's only by agreement. The employer cannot force an employee to accrue TOIL rather than be paid overtime. Similarly, an employee can't insist that they are accruing overtime rather than being paid. So it's by agreement. It is accrued on an hour-for-hour basis. So I work 1 hour of overtime, I accrue 1 hour of leave. I need to then take that TOIL within 6 months of accruing it. So I've got a time limitation on when I can use it. The reason why, so TOIL can be really good. It can be a really great way of managing peaks and troughs in terms of what you need employees to work. Our consistent messaging around TOIL is that it can work really well, but it must be managed well. And what I mean by that is it is hour for hour, which means from the perspective of cost to the business, that works beautifully. But if it has to be paid out, so the employee isn't actually taking the time off, you are paying it out in their pay packet, it has to be paid at the penalty rates or the overtime rates that applied at the time that it was accrued. And that payout can be triggered by a couple of things. One is they haven't taken it within 6 months. So for businesses who have a really long season or a really long period of time in which their casuals and full-timers tend to be working longer hours, it can be a risk situation, because once it's hit that 6-month period, you are supposed to pay it out at the overtime rates. An employee can also request to be paid out TOIL at any time. So an employee can say to you, yes, absolutely, I'll agree to work my overtime and accrue it to TOIL. And you can capture that in writing, but I could turn around in 3 weeks' time and say, actually, I need new tyres on the car. I need you to pay my TOIL out. And you are obliged, the employer is obliged to pay it out at the appropriate penalty rates. It also has to be paid out upon cessation. So if the employee leaves the business and has TOIL accrued, you pay it out again at penalty rates. So, and under the award, there's no maximum number of TOIL hours that can be accrued. You're still allowed to apply a max if you want as an employer, but under the award, there's no limitations on that. Now, where we see this differing quite a bit from banked hours in zombie agreements is that the banked hours are still hour for hour, same as the award, but then if they're paid out, they're hour for hour, which is very different to the award. And interestingly, a lot of the zombie agreements we're seeing do have a maximum, it'll say you can only accrue 152 hours, for example. Now, that's neither here nor there, because a business can still put their own limitations on that if they like. But yeah, essentially, businesses coming off a zombie EA will be not being able to do banked hours anymore, will be doing time off in lieu. And so I think one of the considerations for businesses coming off the zombie agreement is, what do you do with any banked hours that are sitting there now? Can you be encouraging your people to take them at the moment? Should you be paying it out so that it's still at that flat rate and you're not getting hit with a double whammy when you move across to the award? Piece rates. This is the fun one, isn't that? Just everyone's favourite when it came, when all those changes came through. This is also where we see a lot of difference to the zombie agreements. So having said that, when the piece rate legislation came through, it overrode the zombie agreements. So this essentially has been applying for some time now. So what piece rates do, and I will say it can be a really valid way of managing your labour costs when you're coming away from a zombie agreement, or even if you are just operating on the award already. What piece rates do is it says you can agree with an employee to pay them piece rates for tasks performed. That piece rate that you're going to pay them needs to be set so that the average competent worker could earn 15% more than what they otherwise would, whether that's as a casual or a permanent. So you are paying more because of the 15%. But when an employee is on a piece rate, there's no overtime. Ordinary hours don't count, so that scope of hours that we spoke about earlier, and meal allowance is not payable. So yes, you're paying 15% more on average for piecework. However, if you are in the setting where you need a lot of flexibility around the hours in the day that are worked, the amount of hours, if you know that it's very high demand for periods of time and it's likely to cost you a lot in overtime, piece rates can be a good way to keep that under control. There is a minimum payment guarantee, and it's on a daily basis that an employee cannot be paid in a day under piece rates less than what they would have received had they been paid their base rate of pay for each hour that they worked. So you can't drop below that base rate in the award. And you do have to agree in writing to a piece rate, and the award actually gives you a standard template with which to do that. In relation to allowances, the award has a number of set allowances in there, and in fact, we've popped them into a table for you. This is another area that is quite different to zombie agreements. We don't see a lot of allowances in the zombie agreements, or if they're referenced, it will say, for example, leading hand. It will talk about the leading hand rates being wrapped into the hourly rates that are covered by or that are stated in the agreement. So you can see there the leading hand, it shifts depending on the number of employees that are being supervised. There is a wet places allowance, and it's really important to read when these allowances occur. So wet places, for example, is if an employee has to work in any place where their clothing becomes saturated by water, or they have to stand in water or slush so that their feet become wet, unless provided protective clothing and footwear. So a lot of the times, this one, for example, wet places, if you provide the appropriate footwear, the appropriate protective clothing in wet conditions, you don't then also pay the allowance. It's one or the other. First aid is an allowance, so that's a requirement if an employee holds a first aid certificate and are appointed to carry out first aid duties. That second bit is really important. Just because an employee has first aid certification doesn't entitle them to the allowance. You need to be actually saying, right, you are the first aid person available on shift at the moment for that to kick in. And then meal allowance. So if an employee is required to work more than 2 hours overtime, they get a meal allowance, but it needs to happen such that no meals provided, they couldn't reasonably return home, or notice has not been given. From talking with a bunch of growers, my understanding is most of the time, you know when employees are working overtime. They already know the day before that they're being rostered for quite a long day on a certain day. So when all of the hours are worked, that are worked are rostered, even if they're overtime, it doesn't trigger meal. Meal allowance covers that. You know, oh gosh, I had planned to get home by 6 so that I could eat, but all of a sudden I've had to work an extra 2 hours worth of overtime. Of course, I need some food to sustain me. That's when meal allowance comes into play. Travel. The award has a clause in there around travel. So it says that time to travel from one place to another is counted as time worked. So if you've got 2 farm sites, for example, and you've got employees travelling between them in the middle of the day, like they've started work at one place, go to the other, that travel time is counted as time worked. And if they have to stay away from their usual place of residence, then you either need to provide them with accommodation or reimburse reasonable costs to them. Public holidays. This one is an area that we see differing quite a bit to our zombie agreements. So a lot of the zombie agreements simply have public holidays paid at ordinary rates. I've also seen some really odd clauses in there where actually they're paid at double the overtime rates, which doesn't make a ton of sense to me because that's an extreme rate of pay. But under the award, you can still substitute your public holidays by agreement. For full-time and part-time employees, of course, if a public holiday falls on a day they would ordinarily work, but they don't work, they still get paid the public holiday. If they work, they need to be paid 200% of their ordinary rate. And for casuals, again, they don't have an entitlement if they don't work the public holiday. But if they do, it's 225%, which is essentially the 200 plus the 25 casual loading. So just be really conscious if you're moving across that public holidays will incur penalty rates. Leave loading. So under the award, it is standard across most awards in Australia, 17.5 leave loading paid on periods of annual leave. And that's the main points. So I'm going to have a quick look back through the questions just to see what I can still answer for you. What happens if you do have casuals working for harvest? They do 304 hours in 5 weeks and you are finished for the season. Do you have to keep them around for another 3 weeks to go up to 8 weeks, even if you have no more work for the rest of the year? I don't believe you do. So the advice we've received from Fair Work in the past is you essentially the employer sets the 8-week period. You say our 8-week period starts on this date and rolls till here. That triggers the next 8-week period. So You've got that set 8-week period. You could have an employee who works only 4 weeks of that time and does intensive hours, as long as it's averaged out to under the 304 over the 8 weeks, you're okay to apply ordinary rates to all of that. Keep in mind that's strictly for casuals. What if they use overtime from a particular week to accrue toil? But if over the 8-week cycle they do not work more than 304 hours and you have to pay out the toil, you should. Really good question, Darren. Yeah, look, I would accept your argument in the sense of, I mean, normally if you've got a casual, you would be paying them ordinary rates anyway up until, I think what the practice is for a lot of businesses is they just pay casuals ordinary rates until they hit that 304. So they're paying them for each and every hour worked. And then after that, they could accrue to toil. But if you know that you're actually going to have high hours throughout and you apply a bit of a different approach to it, yeah, logic would say to me that if they haven't hit their 304 hours over the 8-week cycle, that you would then say, well, you know, actually we're going to get you to that 304 hours in total. It's no longer toil. It just isn't overtime, essentially, would be what I would argue that to be. Do we need to get a signed agreement to work on a public holiday being a casual employee at ordinary rates? Signed agreement. So if an employee works a public holiday, we have to pay them penalty rates. Even if they agree, even if they say, yeah, look, I'll work the public holiday and you can just pay me my standard rate, we can't, under the award, we can't do that.
Can we swap days?
Yes, absolutely. You can substitute the day.
Okay, so do we need a signed agreement to substitute the day, or is a verbal agreement okay?
Really good question. I don't think it has to be in writing, but I will double check that one for you, and that'll come out when we send it out.
Terrific, thank you.
No worries. If they're required to start work in a different location, e.g. town, are they paid a travel? So do you mean they live in one town, they've got to travel to the next town to even start work? So this is travel from home to work? If Kayleen, if you want to come off of mute. We may not have Kayleen at the moment.
Sorry, yes, off mute now.
Yeah, so when your question there, are they starting work already in one location?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so if they've gone, right, I've started at 8 a.m. here, and then my employer has instructed me to drive to another location to continue work, then that travel time is paid.
Yeah, so if we've instructed them to drive to another location to start work, we don't have to pay travel.
No, you're talking about, right, this is my place of residence and I've said to you, this is the farm you're going to today.
Yep. Yep. So if we're setting
then
them,
I don't believe you do, but that is one I will check.
Yeah, because we've asked Fair Work and we've got 2 different answers. So essentially our home base is in Gat. So we want workers to go and work at our Stanthorpe farm tomorrow. So we've rostered them go to Stanthorpe tomorrow. Do we have to pay them to drive from Gatton to Stanthorpe?
Okay. All right. Let me look into that one for you.
Great.
And
Thank you.
I'll come back, because I also think there's a bit of a reasonable factor in there around if you're asking them to go to a different farm, which is about the same distance that they'd have to travel anyway, versus go and drive 2 hours to even start work. I think there's probably a bit of a that needs to be taken into account.
Thank you. That would be great. Just want some clarity around that one.
One of the things I will say, conscious that it's 12:30, like we've just gone through the award conditions. I'm having a ton of conversations at the moment with members who are on zombie agreements and looking at, do I do a new agreement? What are my best options? If you're needing that kind of conversation, please do reach out through QFVG. I'm finding there's a lot of times where growers will be doing things, paying higher rates of pay, paying permanent employees the same rate as what they got when they were casual, we can still, even outside of an enterprise agreement, just so you understand, you can enter into an individual flexibility agreement, an IFA. It doesn't have the same robustness that a EA has. However, there are certain terms that you are allowed to negotiate around, and those include things like payment of overtime, penalty rates, hours of work, scope of hours. It doesn't mean you can negotiate to not pay them overtime, but it does mean that you can say, for example, well, you know, if we're paying you $35 an hour and the award rate is 27, that extra 8 that we're paying you, we can say, we'll do the maths, but we can say that that covers a certain amount of overtime, a certain amount of working outside of ordinary hours, etc. So do recommend people think about that. And if you're doing that kind of practice, really, really important that you do actually put that into your contract of employment IFA style document, not just rely on a handshake for it. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for staying with us for, for what's relatively dry content and a fast pace to get through it. I hope you've gotten something out of it.